Hi everybody, Krista Cowan here with another episode of One Question with the Barefoot Genealogist. This week's question is, how do I find the maiden names of the women in my family tree? We've received several variations of that question, and so today what I'm going to take the time to do is just give you some tips and tricks. Hopefully give you enough information that you can just start to think about it in a little bit different way. I could teach an hour-long class on this, but unfortunately we've only got 20 minutes and I've got 10 tips. So let's go. First off, the number one tip to finding women's maiden names is marriage records. That seems pretty obvious, but make sure that you don't discount all of the different kinds of marriage records. There's not just certificates, but there's applications for licenses. There's wedding announcements. There's engagement announcements. There's banns and bonds. Divorce records, also considered a marriage record, and then civil registrations. Now, when you do finally find that record, pay close attention to what you're looking at. Here's just one example. This couple was married on December 23rd, 1900 in the parish of Old Ford, London. Here's the name of the groom, and here's the name of the bride, Ellen Adams. Now, before you get so excited that you found her maiden name, this 20-year-old woman was a widow. And so it's possible that Adams is not her maiden name, but the last name that she had previous to this, her previous husband. Over here, it actually lists the father's name and surname. You can see here he was originally listed as John James Adams. Somebody's crossed out Adams, and they've written Collins. So I would go looking for a John James Collins with a daughter named Ellen, who was born about 1880. Number two. Oh, I skipped ahead. Number two, cemeteries. So pay attention, not just to, just because their maiden name isn't on the tombstone, pay attention to what else is going on. Look at the burial record. See if it has any information about her maiden name. Look at adjacent plots. Who's buried around them? Are there other family names that pop up close to them? Pay attention to the name of the cemetery. If your ancestor, Elizabeth Jones, was buried in the Lawrence family cemetery, maybe that's a clue that her maiden name was Lawrence. I'd go searching to see if I could prove or disprove that idea. Number three seems another kind of obvious one, census records. Now, some of you may be looking at that and thinking, well, if I don't know her last name, how do I find her in a census record? I'm actually talking about making sure that you get the full run of census records for your ancestor as a married woman, and maybe even go so far as to make sure you trace all of her children in the census. Let me just give you one example, and this actually comes from one of your emails. You were asking about a woman named Louisa Moss. She was born, here it says either January or June, I can't make it out right now, in 1842 in England, married to a Joseph Moss. The question was about how to find her maiden name. I dug through a few census records and pulled up this one, where you'll notice there's a woman named Catherine Harrison living in this household. She's listed as a sister-in-law, and her marital status is listed as single. Now make sure you pay attention to that marital status. If she had been divorced or widowed, it's possible that Harrison is not a last name that could be the maiden name for Louisa. But because she's single and because she's listed as a sister-in-law, chances are Louisa's maiden name is Harrison. Certainly worth looking further into. Like I said, also make sure you get the full run of census records for those children as they grow up and start their own households. Many times I have found maiden aunts and elderly uncles living in the homes of some of those children. And again, you'll end up with clues to the maiden name of that mother. Number four is land records. Now, land records seems like a little bit of an obscure thing for some of you, especially those of you who are brand new to genealogy. Don't be intimidated by them. We have quite a few on Ancestry.com, and what you're looking for is, if your family owned property, how did they come into possession of that property? Did they purchase it? Was it a land grant? Or was it somehow deeded to them or transferred to them as part of an inheritance? So certainly in some periods of time, women weren't allowed to own property. And so if you look and see who did this family get this property from, and if the last name is different, it could be that the family was left property from the mother's family, from the mother's father. So again, just ways to gather clues about what her maiden name possibly could be, and then you go chasing down to see if that family has a daughter of this first name about the right age, and you start to build that case. Okay, church records is my number 5 tip. Use church records, and not just the church records that we traditionally think about, which is christenings and marriages and burials, but also look for membership records. In a lot of churches, the woman's maiden name is recorded as part of her membership in that church. In addition, I would also look for other members of the congregation. Frequently extended family joined churches together. They move to a new area, they start a new church, or they join a church together. And so look for surnames that keep popping up that are similar. And again, then you can track down and see if anybody with that last name had a daughter with this first name who's about the right age. And this works even in pre-census time. You know, a lot of times people are frustrated about that pre-1850 census records where it only lists the head of household. These are the kinds of records where you can start to get names out of these records for those households. Number 6 tip is probate records and wills. Again, we have lots of these on Ancestry.com, and they're, I think, a far underutilized resource, but I love them because they provide fantastic clues. As a matter of fact, let me just switch over to a live search screen here and show you just one example, again, from one of your requests. You were actually looking for a woman who was born in the mid to late 1700s. Her name was Jeanette, and it can be spelled lots of different ways. I've marked it exact because I've already done the search, but she was married to a man whose name was William Hunter, and they were living in Pennsylvania, particularly in Chester County is where they lived. And you wanted to know what Jeanette's maiden name was. How do you find that? So I did some digging, and when I click search here, you'll notice that tax, criminal, land, and wills comes up as a category with some search results. When I click on that, here is one in Chester County. Now what you're going to see here in this is actually an abstract. Clearly it's not the original will. It's just an abstract of that will, and we're going to go through it so that you can start to see where you pull out some of these clues. I love this. So to Jeanette, wife of William Hunter. So I think we probably have the right person. This will was proven in 1803, so it's about the right time period. We're in Chester County, so it's the right place. Even further to that, it lists Jeanette and William's children, David, Sarah, Nancy, Polly, Jeanette, right? So we start to narrow in that we're pretty sure we have the right Jeanette, right? And they're willed some things here in this will. Then there's some other people mentioned in this will. A Hannah Kincaid and her daughters. A William Neely Sr. and his wife. Their son James and their daughters. A woman named Mary Ellen, who is the daughter of James Thompson. A William Taggart. A Samuel Neely, a Robert Neely, and Edward McCune. The executors of the will are William and James Neely and David Hunter. So certainly the Neely family and the Hunter family are connected some way. If I was just to make a supposition off of the information here, I would guess that Jeanette her maiden name is Neely, and that Hannah Kincaid was also born a Neely. I would guess that maybe James Thompson was married to one of the Neely daughters, and that daughter has since passed away, but Mary Ellen then is a Neely grandchild. Right? So then I would go about seeing if I can prove whether or not there was a Neely family that had these children, particularly this daughter Jeanette. So wills provide really great clues to what a woman's maiden name might possibly be. And if you remember, all I did was search on her married name with a location of the time and place that I thought she would be found. Okay, number 7. is newspapers. Now again, newspapers may seem like a really obvious thing to some of you. Others of you may think I'm a little crazy, but let me show you an example of a way that I found a woman's maiden name in my family because of a newspaper. Now, I had done lots of searches for this woman. Her name was Elizabeth. She was married to a man whose last name was Raymond. They were living in Iowa, and I wasn't able to, I had no success. But one of the things that I learned as I started looking through some of those newspapers is that women oftentimes, in newspapers in particular, were listed as Mrs. and then their husband's name. And so I went looking for her that way. And what I found was in the Ida County Pioneer Record on January 10th, 1952, this little blurb here that lists Mrs. Charles Casey of Correctionville, so that's the right town, visited Thursday with her daughter, Mrs. Ernest Raymond. And so now I know that Mrs. Ernest Raymond likely, her maiden name likely is Casey. Now, Mrs. Charles Casey is her mother. I know that's what this tells me, right? But keep in mind the mother may have remarried. And so Charles Casey may not be the father of Elizabeth Raymond, but Mrs. Charles Casey is certainly the mother of Mrs. Ernest Raymond. Do you feel like you're taking an SAT test? That kind of sounded like an SAT problem. Okay, so again, use these as clues and then go looking for a Charles Casey to see if he has a daughter named Elizabeth in about the right age, about the right time period. These are just great clues. One of the other reasons I love newspapers, if you look at some of the little blurbs on this page, right? It's better than Facebook. They were telling people in the weekly newspaper about the comings and goings, right? Mr. and Mrs. William Putinson and family were Sunday supper guests of the Joy family, and because I'm related to most of these people, I happen to know that the Putinsons and the Joys are cousins. This one I love, right? Mr. and Mrs. Harry Ogren and Ronnie and Judy, who are their children, spent New Year's Eve with her sister and husband, Mr. and Mrs. Emery Brandt of Marcus. Another sister and her husband, Mr. and Mrs. Robert Schroeder of Marcus, were also there, right? Now, that may not seem important, but look at this, right? If you know that what the name is of Mrs. Harry Ogren, one of the things that we find challenging in family history isn't just finding the maiden name of that grandmother, great-grandmother, whatever. Sometimes it's also finding the married names of those daughters. And so if you happen to know who Mrs. Harry Ogren is, now you just have to figure out which one of her sisters married Emery Brandt and which one of her sisters married Robert Schroeder, and you know their married names. So it works both directions, whether you're going backwards in time or whether you're coming down and searching for those descendants. Okay, that was tip number 7, newspapers. Tip number 8, birth and death records. Again, that may seem terribly obvious to some of you, but especially as we get back further in time, birth records are not as readily available. It might be difficult to find a birth record for her, but look for birth records for all of her children, not just the one that you're descended from, and see if the mother's maiden name was recorded there. Also, look for the death records, both hers and again her children's. Oftentimes the death record will record the mother's maiden name. Now I would suggest that you just because you find a maiden name on a death record, find the death records for all of her children if you can. Informants on death records, particularly because it's a traumatic time often, aren't always thinking very clearly. I've seen death records where it asks for the mother's maiden name, and the informant gave their mother's maiden name, not the maiden name of the deceased. And so, again, the more records you get, the more clues you have, the more accurate or closer that you get to the truth. So collect the death records for all of her children and see what you can find. Just an example of that I love, in my family, I was looking for an Ellen. She had married a man named Samuel Moliner. And on her death record, it listed both her maiden name, right? Her father was William Tate, but then there I also have her mother's maiden name, so Elizabeth Xavier. Great, great, great records. Number 9 is military records. Now, very frequently we associate military records with men, but one of the great military records are pension files. Pension files, in order for a woman to apply for her husband's pension, oftentimes she had to prove their marriage. And so every once in a while you'll find marriage certificates slipped in to that pension packet or that packet of pension information. And so look for that. If a marriage certificate wasn't available, sometimes they had to provide an affidavit that they really were married. Sometimes that affidavit was provided by somebody who was a witness to the marriage, so a brother or an uncle or a father. So again, those military records can a lot of times provide clues. And my 10th and final tip, because we're almost out of time and I think we made it, is naming patterns. Pay attention to the naming patterns in the family, and not just the first names, but look to see if you can find the middle names of the children in the family. A lot of times what we find is that sons are given their mother's maiden name as a middle name. Certainly not in every family, and just because one of your uncles has a name that looks like a surname as his middle name doesn't automatically mean that was his mother's maiden name. I have two in my family. I have a Robert Watson Cowan. That's my, third great grandfather, and he has a brother named Jacob Pitzer Cowan, and Watson and Pitzer, neither of those are their mother's maiden name. Turns out that Robert Watson was a next door neighbor and presumably a friend of the family, and Jacob Pitzer was the doctor who delivered the children in the family, and so they named their sons that way. But pay attention to that and see if you can't, again, prove or disprove that these surnames that you see popping up, whether they're on marriage records, whether they're in the cemetery, whether it's other people living in the household on a census record, who they either inherited or purchased their land from, who they're going to church with, who's leaving them things in wills, all of that just leads you to possible surnames that you can then investigate to prove or disprove whether or not that's the maiden name of the woman in your family tree. Well, I hope this has been useful for you. If you have a question for me, feel free to email me at ask@ancestry.com. We do read all of your emails, and we put together presentations like this that hopefully answer some of your questions in a little bit more generic way so that you can then take these learnings and apply them to your own research. And as you notice tonight, every once in a while, I also will use a few of your tough problems to answer the question of the day. That's all I have for you this week. Let me know how it works out for you looking for those maiden names. And until next time, this is Krista Cowan. I hope you have fun climbing your family tree, no matter which direction you're going.